Hello all and welcome to another video. Today I want to talk about Cardano and the system that you seem to be interested in putting together to run a staking node. Um, so we'll go through the requirements that we know so far and eventually get to what I want to build mine out to be based off of the knowledge we have now. Before we get into it, I would like to go through a little bit about myself. First off, I am not a financial advisor, and you should do your own research on the risks involved in investing and in the projects that you want to invest in. Um, I am a computer technician with knowledge of computer systems hardware and software. I have a degree and certifications in networking, server administration. Most importantly, I believe a select few crypto projects can transform our lives for the better, Cardano being one of them. You need to talk about return on investment if you're going to invest money in buying hardware for a system. Even if you are not planning on buying hardware, you have something already lying around, that still could cost you money on your return on investment. And I'll go through those potential scenarios. Um, there are areas to protect against diminishing returns through cost of hardware and software purchasing. Um, that is choosing between using Linux, Mac, and Windows OS. And then even within those, there's desktop and server operating systems. Power consumption is something that can diminish your return on investment. Having your system be reliable, um, as you can read in the Cardano staking documentation, that you can lose money if you're not running pretty much 24/7, 365. They want you to be up and operational for near 100% of the time. Also, security can be a risk for diminishing returns of your investment. Node requirements. Nodes are required to be running near 100% uptime, 24/7, 365, like I said before. What that means is you can't have the system having updates coming through that are going to take it offline. You need to have hardware that is capable of running 24/7 and not heating up and killing the hardware faster. Um, you need decent bandwidth. I would say a minimum of 10 megabits per second. That's pretty much standard broadband nowadays. Me personally, I'll have a gigabit internet where I'm going to be hosting the node. Um, I'm already using gigabit at my place of living, and so there will be no change there as of cost since I'm going to be using the internet for multiple purposes. And then one of the last things that's required is an SSD. They say of at least 35 gigabytes, but need more space for the OS and the blockchain to grow. So I would say it would be pretty safe and future-proof yourself to just get something bigger than 35 gigs. And we'll go into that a little bit later. Um, so my suggestions for components, we'll start with operating systems. So um, we have three operating systems that are supported within the Cardano nodes. Um, Windows 10 specifically, Linux, and then Mac OS, or I believe it's called iOS. Um, Now there's trade-offs for each one of them, such as Windows 10 that costs money. It also has issues with even on the enterprise versions of uh, Windows operating system, Windows 10. You can't control it from restarting and trying to do Windows updates. Also, with the Windows side, another potential issue is it's more of a resource intensive operating system. So um, you'll have more resources dedicated to just the operating system, even at idle. That's why I've chose not to go with Windows 10. Um, I've also chose not to go with Mac OS because there are certain user agreement licenses with that I just don't want to deal with building a system and then putting that on that system. Now, if I had a desktop Mac, maybe I might do that, but there's also reasons against using a computer you already have unless it kind of matches what I'm going to be laying out for my setup. So I'm going with Linux because it's free and it's stable and pretty secure. It's also pretty easy to use once you kind of get into it. Easy to pick up stuff. There's a lot of information on the internet to walk you through just about everything. So specifically, I'm going to be using Ubuntu. Uh, I'm going to be using the LTS, which is basically long service use. So if you want servers that don't or that need less interruptions and needs to be more stable, that's what the LTS is. And then specifically, I'm going to be using um, 18.4.2. All right, so there's one more technically operating system that I will be using within my system, and I'll explain why. Um, so that software that's pretty much an operating system is called Proxmox. It is a virtualization um, component, and it will boot up before the Linux operating system. What it will be beneficial for is because since it's a virtualization manager, um, you can have snapshots and backups of your um, node and redeploy those pretty fast if one got corrupt or a hard drive failed, or even worse yet, if your motherboard or CPU died and you wanted to just have a system, even any random system, it doesn't even have to have the hardware matching. You can spin up Proxmox on a new system fairly fast and go to one of your backups. Hopefully, you don't have your backups stored on the same system as the node. Um, you can redeploy that backup, and then you'll probably have to let it sit for a little while to catch up, depending on how far back the last backup was. You'll have to catch the blockchain backup, but that will limit your downtime significantly, even if you have a catastrophic failure. So that in particular is why I would go with having Proxmox to run the Linux operating system that will run the node. Um, Next, so we'll talk about the CPU. So we can go with quite a few different CPUs. There's ARM CPUs, there's Intel, AMD. Um, I'm not going into Raspberry Pis because even the devs said that it's probably not going to be powerful enough, or at least optimal enough to run what they're expecting to be run. So I'm sticking with primarily Intel and AMD. I went with a AMD Ryzen 5 2400G. The reason why I went with this is the second generation Ryzen in the AMD family, or AMD producer of the chip. The reason why I went with this was a couple reasons. Price was huge. I don't want to spend a lot of money if I don't need to. Um, the power consumption was low. It is a 64 or 65 watt CPU, but it had the better idle and load um, power consumption. Um, the less power that you are consuming while under load, the less money is flowing out of your pocket while running and managing your node. Um, and as well, Intel's, as of lately, been having vulnerabilities pop up, uh, and AMD has not been plagued with as many. So therefore, your CPU, if you go with AMD, will be more secure. Also, going back on operating system, the reason why I would go with Linux is because it is going to be more secure than Windows. It's not perfect. Unlike what Mac says, they don't have to deal with viruses. Mac are not as vulnerable to viruses because there's not as many people using them. So therefore, there's not a big enough need to make viruses to get data and scam people. So therefore, there are more on Windows. Um, so going back to CPU, security, price, and power consumption. All right, next, the next requirement was having an SSD, and they were talking about minimum 35 gigs. Uh, from the digging I've gone through, um, it wasn't totally clear, but they said it might take 3 to 6 gigs a month of the blockchain uh, being saved and stored on your system. Now, I wouldn't recommend going for a NVMe SSD. Those are basically the M.2s that they're not like traditional hard drives, and you have to have a specific slot on your motherboard or a PCIe card to put into your system to connect those. I'm just going with a standard Western Digital 500 gig SATA SSD. Those are fairly cheap. You can get those approximately $65, $66 currently. You could probably even get a better deal when there's a sale. You could go with 1 terabyte, although from my calculations, you could go a couple years without totally going and using your full 500 gigs. So that's why I'm going with 500 gigs. RAM's not really a big deal, but that would be the next thing on the list. There was no specific requirements for RAM, so I just went with kind of a generic choice, and that would be two 4 gig pairs of RAM. DDR4, so it'd be a total of 8 gigs with the two 4 gig pairs. That's going to cost you about 30 bucks. Doesn't look like you need super fast RAM. Um, like I said in the previous slides, it's the internet speed, the uptime, and the SSD storage. SSD are faster than mechanicals, so SSDs are the way to go. And we cannot forget about the motherboard with recommended 1 gig, 1 gigabit NIC or network card, uh, preferably built onto the motherboard. You don't need to get a PCIe um, gigabit NIC if you can get one that's on the board itself. You also need a power supply. I'd say minimum 300 watts. I don't see it really needing more. Um, Once I build my system, I will be more specific. But for now, you know, gauging everything, 300 watts should be fine. Last thing you really need is a case for everything to go into. Um, Now, when you set this up, especially if you set it up the way I'm setting up, you will temporarily need a monitor. Um, but if you use Proxmox, there's a web uh, environment that you can log on to from any computer within your network, unless you set it up to have static IP so you can reach it outside. Wouldn't recommend that, but uh, with my setup with Proxmox, you won't need a monitor or a keyboard. All you'll need is a power cord and a NIC card or Ethernet card to be plugged into the system. You can have it tucked away somewhere, um, given that it's not in a way in an area where heat will be building up around it. Um, so yeah, that's my suggestions for the components. You don't need a graphics card to uh, be getting an advantage. The way they set this up is you're not really getting any advantage once you get the basics in place for your node. Um, so yeah, uh, now final things let's talk about is again, I am a single person, and I came up with this through my own experience and research. I could very well be missing a point or a factor, and I encourage everyone to get involved and communicate, especially with me, so I can better inform everyone. Uh, you can reach me uh, reach out on any of the platforms that I have posted the video on, such as YouTube, or you could just email me directly at pcfixpdx@gmail.com. And I appreciate all the videos you were watching and feedback that you are sending my way, and I hope you enjoyed. Take care.